right. Hello and welcome back, everyone. We are here for the 13th and final discussion of Hayden White's Tropics of Discourse, Essays in Cultural Criticism. And we have made it, actually. Believe it or not, it's for me difficult to believe that we made it this far. We finished this project. So that
before June, right? Did we like start in June or something like that?
I don't know. I was in a different part of the world. I was in Hong Kong.
You were? Oh my gosh! The book club has like followed your life journey and everything. Wow.
Before we get into this essay, John, would you like to show our next book, Benjamin Fontaine?
Yeah. So as Davood just said, we're going to be wrapping up the discussion of Hayden White that Daniel and Davood have read so patiently with me. I'm the one who suggested this, and I don't think I don't know Daniel, if you had known of David White, and I think he was new to Davood. They both just said okay and went along with the ride for 6 months. Mm-hmm. So I'm incredibly grateful for them being so kind as to do that. This next one, our next read, and we will have another one. We plan to start sometime in January. Is a book from the New York Review of Books press. And it was one I just sort of stumbled across in their philosophy section. They do sort of an interesting job curating some work that has never become quite popular or fallen out of popularity. And I found this. It's called Existential Monday by Benjamin Fontaine. And he was apparently a Romanian-born French philosopher who was killed in the concentration camps during World War II, but wrote this either during the war or shortly before. And it's not going to take as much of our time. It is not including the introduction. It's something around 80 pages. So we'll probably make a couple of discussions out of it and move on to something else. But this is what we're reading next. So if you want to read along with us or anything like that, that should give you a solid month or so to get the text and be able to read with us.
Mm-hmm. That's great. All right, back to Hayden White. The title of this last essay is The Absurdist Moment in Contemporary Literary Theory. And it was published originally in 1976 and a few years later in this collection, maybe a couple of years later. And the topic, as the title suggests, is literary theory and how it, according to Hayden White, as the way it progresses, its own unfolding according to its own internal logic, gets to a moment or develops into a stage of absurdity, for lack of a better term. And that means that the fundamental distinctions that literary theory is driven by, that literary theory begins by recognizing, like the distinction between literature and criticism, or literature and life, literature and experience, and the function of literature in relation to life, and the function of criticism in relation to literature. So those fundamental distinctions, fundamental categories, they begin to shake, and the boundary between them begins to get blurry. That is where what White refers to as the normal critics, they get attacked by, or they get criticized by, the absurdist critics. I'll read one passage from the second page of the essay. It is from the second paragraph. This is the point where one of the functions of, Hayden White is talking about, one of the primary functions of absurdist critics, absurdist literary critics, is to make points that are not just about literature, but also about criticism itself. So they reflect on their own tasks. And that's one of the reasons why, because they take it so seriously and they apply it to themselves, they begin to destabilize the whole discipline. So we read here, quote, when the absurdist critic, Foucault, Barthes, Derrida, comment on a literary artifact, it is always in the interest of making a meta-critical point. But it is difficult for the normal critic to ignore the absurdist critic, for the latter always shows himself to take the critical enterprise more seriously than the former. He is willing to bring the critical enterprise itself under question. End quote. So it is, again, the directing of that function, the enterprise of criticism, and applying it to criticism itself. and begins the process of destabilization. Now we can discuss several points here, whether this is an inevitability, as White seems to suggest, that inevitably the absurdist moment will arrive because of if we take theory seriously, and other related points. Please, Daniel.
I'll go next.
No. Okay, John.
So he starts out and talks about how we have something like normative criticism up through roughly World War II. And again, he's talking about normative criticism kind of in the way that we used to think about the social sciences in a naive way, about how we can use language as this crystalline, transparent tool to communicate ideas about a text, its history, its meaning, its interpretation in a very unproblematic way. So this idea this assumption basically underlies pretty much all of 19th century literary criticism, Ruskin, and everything before it. And then somehow having two world wars in the span of a generation causes this sort of rupture with previous assumptions. And it's not an automatic thing. It happens over a few decades. And I would place it a little bit later than White does. I would say it's more like the 60s than World War II. 60s is really when Derrida pops into everything. But where the assumption behind normal criticism, which is that you can sort of break experience up into these nice, neat little categories. This is the text, and this is my life, and this is the language I use to describe it, and this is the world outside of the text. These lines start to get blurred, like Davood said. But we use language, but it's a sense of how deeply you want to question that language. Normal criticism makes the strong assumption that language does its job in a reliable way, and I think if we can talk about this as we get more into it, but what he'll end up calling absurdist criticism, does an interesting thing in questioning the role of language, but it's kind of like the Ouroboros, the monster that eats its own tail. It's sort of, in doing it, it can go too far, and it's a little bit absurd. I mean, and you end up, he has that saying at the very beginning of the essay where we start to worship silence. And when literary criticism is all about silence, he says something like, that's the sign of a culture that has become totally unmoored from itself. And I kind of agree with that. But
no, that's wonderful. And yeah, gentlemen, 6 months, my goodness. I've enjoyed this immensely and look forward to what's to come. I'm so glad we could come together. It's kind of like with criticism, when you're criticizing literature and suggesting that literature is not possible, doesn't that kind of make the criticism you just did vanish? Doesn't it just kind of take its whole self with it? So I like the image you have there of the snake eating its own tail. And it's kind of like, in some respects, kind of how I envision kind of what's happened. It's almost like for a very long time, we were wearing a pair of glasses, and then World War II or the 60s came along, and someone's like, wait a minute, you're wearing glasses. You're like, don't you see? And it's like, there was actually a construct here that you were operating according to. And you're like, oh my gosh. But then the problem is, maybe the absurdist critic is like, and then they just leave the glasses off. They're like, see, they're not real eyes, so we need to stop using them. It's like, but I literally can't see. I have to do some form of reading, some sort of analysis in order to give the world meaning. No, man, it's just a pair of glasses. It's not real eyes. And so you have this sort of weird self-devouring that can occur if you don't go that far. Now, some of the thinkers, I should also note, I agree. We were talking about before we started recording on this idea that very often Mr. White is accused of being someone like a Derrida, or Foucault, or a Barthes, or this deconstructional class of critics. And I think this essay does a good job of showing that there's some distance, there's some separation between his project and some of these different modes. Now, some of the scholars of, say, Foucault and Derrida and Barthes may say that this is this sort of idea that they're saying that there's no you can't read anything because it doesn't make any sense, or it's all deconstructional, that might be a stereotype, that they might be saying things different than that. But I do think it's quite clear that there are a lot of people inspired by those thinkers, of whom have gone in an absurdist direction. That gets us into the question of to what, I don't think Derrida, from what I recall of On Grammatology, is saying that any interpretation goes. For example, I think he wants to say that a lot more interpretations go than we think, but not any interpretation. It's much wider. Someone like Barthes, in saying that the author is dead, he's not saying that the accomplishments of the author are not so great. They want to say that authors are almost a point that's collecting all of these different streams together. So you can't isolate the meaning of a text simply by determining what the author thinks. That doesn't mean that the text has no meaning at all. It just means that the text is really difficult to determine meaning. That's how I think some of those writers are. Doesn't change the fact that they have inspired, maybe through a Harold Bloom misreading or whatever, a type of criticism that I think indeed falls into the absurdism that Mr. White is talking about. So I think anyone who might be listening to this that takes issue with the association that he has of these thinkers with that way of interpretation should keep in mind that even if it's the case that the original thinkers maybe were more nuanced, that they still managed, I think, to inspire followers that fall into the pitfalls that Mr. White is discussing. But it's quite interesting. We've gone through, reading Mr. White, where we've really raised the stakes of literature being so important, thinking literary, having a literary mindset to go into history being a genre of literature. And then you turn around and you're like, oh, but we're not really good at literary criticism right now. So I just kind of suggested that in order to understand history, we need to be able to think literarily, and the state of literary criticism may not be so good. Oh, darn. That needs to be corrected in order to really kind of, and then I'll pass it on to Davood, to really bring about sort of the change that he wants to bring, that he seems to want to engender, that is not assisted if you have literary criticism that is devouring its own tail.
Great. I'd like to take it back to what John said. John mentioned the phrase normative criticism, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Normative criticism, which implies that you can clarify what you mean. It was actually, I wanted to ask.
I meant to say normal, but normative is just as true.
Yeah. So it implies, normative criticism implies that the categories of good and bad in literary works, literary artifacts. This is a good piece of literature, has more merit, more value. It is a better reflection of maybe human nature or the culture of a time, and correspondingly worse or bad works or failing works of literature. So that takes for granted, that's normal or normative approach to criticism, takes for granted those things, and that evaluation, the process of judgment, process of categorizing or putting on a scale, it implies that there are a set of tasks, maybe not one task, but there are a set of tasks that a work of literature can, or literary work can fulfill, the standards that literary artifact can live up to or fail to live up to. And critics can keep working with these standards of evaluation for a while, but they can also get interrupted after some time with other approaches, like what White refers to as the reductive or reductionist approaches to criticism. Somebody might come and offer a Marxist critique or a feminist critique or a colonial critique, and say, all these things that you're talking about, you're forgetting, you're neglecting the political dimension, the political network or matrix within which these works of literature are being written. Maybe the structures or imbalances of power, the political forms of oppression, these works are fitting into it and maybe perpetuating it. So these normal critics get into it, they feel like, oh, this is like our work is now, it's not as stable anymore. So enough times, if these kinds of interruptions happen enough times, more and more it becomes unclear, and these criticism continues to develop its own genres. And it's like, okay, this genre of criticism, feminist criticism, is so different from, let's say, a formalist criticism. And how do we evaluate? How do we choose which one of these we apply? So this is, I'm trying to kind of capture the process of destabilization and proliferation of forms within criticism, within works of critique. So,
do you mean to ask how the destabilization comes about, or why there are simply so many forms of what he's calling absurdism?
How is that? How does that come out of the practice of normative criticism? And
okay, so my answer to that would I thought he made a very interesting. I'm not sure this is going to quite answer your question. He made an interesting comment near the beginning of the essay about how once something's value is suddenly called into question, like literary criticism, it tends to become fetishized. So he even talks about money, the fact that when we see money, just ideologically, now we see something that has value, but really money is just a nearly valueless piece of paper with some ink on it. But our ideology in living in a society that uses money to purchase things, sometimes very expensive things, shows us intuitively that money is more than that, even though it's not really more than that. And so that's sort of like, I think what he's getting at with fetishization. And I think that whole fetishizing process is what allows you to go in so many different directions. He hints that a couple of the quotes that he takes from one of the theorists that he talks about reading being a divine sort of hieratic experience, like this worshipful experience, which just sort of confuses him, I think. And it's like, why is this not a very worldly thing? I mean, it's a text you can hold in your hands, and but I mean, if you're familiar with criticism from the last 50 or 60 years, it's sort of a very common theme to read stuff like that, and people like Paul de Man and Derrida, and et cetera, et cetera. But does that answer your question at all?
Yeah. That, by the way, that essay that he quoted extensively, it was an essay by Poulet. That's the surname of the writer, and the title was "Phenomenology of Reading." I happened to. It's one of those things that I read.
Oh, really?
I read the essay during my undergraduate. I don't remember the context, but I came across it. It's a very mysterious, very interesting essay. It's worth reading, and
all I did was recognize the name. I've never read anything by him.
It highlights this fact that sometimes we read something and this work of art itself is so foreign to us.
Yeah, separate from us. Yeah.
Yeah, it is working. We feel it working, but we don't feel necessarily a connection to it. So we don't recognize ourselves in it. What did you think, Daniel, about any of this?
No, that's excellent. Well, when you were speaking, I think what John was saying about the fetishization. I just do think White is suggesting that, where everyone wants to come in and get their part. For example, this thing is very valuable, so everyone's going to take their part of it and make it their own, and it's and so forth and so on. And then it was interesting because if I recall, then it's almost like there could be a response to that reductionism that's then an inflation, like a reaction against, where then we're going to say no, literature is too holy and great to be so fetishized. But that's of course problematic, because then if I recall, he talks about it almost like you make it a Platonic thing, which then it has nothing to do with cultural currents, and that's a bad reaction. So you start with the normative, then and I think elementary, was that what he talked about that as well? Those kind of went together. So you had the elementary, then there's some sort of event or something happens where it's then ruptured, and then there's a reductionism. And then in response to that, there's then an inflation, which is a reaction against the reductionism. And I understand Mr. White is suggesting that the inflation is not exactly the correct response, that he wants to get back to something that doesn't just reduce it to these different streams and say it's nothing more than that, but he also doesn't want to treat it as Platonic. To go back to your question a little bit, I think I found it very interesting, and I think it was toward the end, where he suggests that perhaps the entire movement of absurdism, absurd criticism, I got stuck on my tongue for some reason. Perhaps that was part of Western thought, with the division between the actual and the appearance, that you get in like Plato or different things. Once you start saying that, there's a real meaning of the text and everything else is a false meaning. Well, that right there is a problematic idea that needed to be deconstructed. But arguably, in having that be deconstructed, you can go too far then, right? Where then I once heard it, because bringing up Barth, I heard, I think it was, what class was it in? We were reading the Ramayana with maybe Professor Nimick or something. It was Hindi, Middle Eastern literature. And one of the students asked, they said something like, what did the writer mean? And Professor Nimick said, sorry, you don't get off that easy. And I always thought that was really interesting, because what Professor Nimick was trying to get at was that you want to make this act of reading easier by figuring out what the author intended, but actually you don't get off so easy. You have to read harder, not because what the author thought doesn't matter or isn't there or isn't relevant, but there can be this practice of avoiding the difficulty of reading by simply trying to determine what the author said. And if it's the case, if Barth or whoever is correct that we can't do that anymore, there's not this Platonic form of the author's intention that we can access. There's two responses to that. There can be well, what's the point of reading then, and give it up entirely? Or there could be the response of trying to reclaim a Platonic form with the inflated reading that's not really going in the right direction, which I think the right direction is is upping the ante on reading. Like, reading becomes a much fuller and deeper act where you have to work harder in reading and figuring out the art of interpretation and hermeneutics, because we can't simply absolve ourselves that difficulty by figuring out what the author intended. So that's kind of what I think White is pointing to, that I took it. And I do think what John was suggesting at the beginning, and then I'll pass it back off, I do agree that it seems like the absurd criticism begins more in the 60s, but World War II, the upsetting of the progressive narrative with World War I, all of these, it does make it seem like the normal is no longer going to cut it, or the normal assumptions of history are no longer going to cut it. And that might be part two of that destabilization of the given that history is going to go in a progressive direction. Like I've been reading this biography on Keynes and all his involvement in the Bloomsburg group. And it's just so fascinating how genuinely they believed right before World War I, as World War I is developing, because you have Bloomsburg before World War I and then between World War I and World War II, how they really just believed that history was going to go a certain direction, and then it wasn't, and the cognitive dissonance that developed and how that affected the formation of their literature and their thinking. So I think that too is part of how you get into the moving in the direction of the reductionist criticism. I think it all kind of plays together, as well as and perhaps the fetishization that we're describing is to a natural reaction against feeling like everything's falling apart, because you're trying to grab your fragment of what's falling apart while you can, and lifting it up as having supreme value, so you can give yourself some sort of stability again once the normal has been so destabilized.
Yeah, and related to that, I'm glad that you also mentioned this inflationary. Is that the term?
Inflationary, something like that.
Inflationary, which is also a reaction to looking at literature as hyper contextualized, as after the death of the so-called death of the author, and just things reflecting socio-political, cultural movements. Works of literature they start to lose their status as works of literature. So we have this so-called inflationary response that wants to, again, elevate and decontextualize and isolate literary works, artistic works, and say, no, let's just consider them in their own terms. Let's just confront works of art, works of literature, and try to find their own, their within them, not from outside, not by connecting the work to its context, but within it in its own terms. It's based on its own internal structure, trying to evaluate it, and then realizing that some works are better, some works are masterful. They reflect excellence in skill, and that was one aspect of the inflationary approach, or what White calls it. That the other one is that as a consequence of this flooding of information, because there's so much information, works of art and works of literature now need to make themselves really special and almost mystical. And that's another reason why some critics inflate them and trying to make them or claim about them that they are larger than life. But that, again, is something that if you pause on it, if you just accept it, after a while, it leads to absurdism, because it just cannot be maintained. That level of that kind of value, nothing can sustain it. Because, as you said, you said that that one response to Hayden White is to up the ante on reading. But another maybe flip side of that would be to say that reading, we can think of it as just one human activity among all the other human activities. That is not as special as we might initially think. That, you know, farming is also another human activity. You know, conversation, parenting, all these things are, you know, they're all special. And reading and writing, these are just one among all the others, and they're all special.
Well, Moore's law says that, you know, about every 2 years, 16 months to 24 months, that we double our ability, our ability to computing power. And I was just thinking about how interesting it was that all of this by, I guess what he's talking about is the absurdist sort of strain of things, just starts to happen around the rise of the internet. Not everyone's ability to access it, but the theoretical beginnings of it in the late 60s and early 70s. And then, you know, 20 years later, it becomes popular, and it seems like 200, 300 years ago, it would have been possible for one person to know everything. And now it's not just even remotely conceivable. So I wanted to talk about careerism through the spectrum of the essay. It's interesting how the fetishizing takes place, and how texts or criticism suddenly increases its stakes, becomes more important, more alluring, because it is fetishized. And I wonder to what degree that might just be because everyone writing the literary criticism is a literary critic. You know, it's sort of like this, it's a really good career move to say that your own career is super important now more than ever, you know? It's like, and then a completely different angle on the career question would be, I was wondering why Hayden White is situating himself, if this is actually a distancing thing, as Daniel suggested, which I think it could easily be read that way, why he's situating himself within a tradition of literary criticism instead of within a tradition of historiography. Unless that's simply because the two have simply become so infused with one another. We know, as people fairly well read in the social sciences, that literary criticism has worked its way into pretty much every other branch of the humanities, but he goes out of his way to only talk about literary critics. I mean, he talks about Foucault, but he doesn't really talk about him. The people he goes out of his way to quote from are literary critics. I was just wondering what either one of you might think about either of those two things.
I'll just say briefly that I didn't see it as I didn't see it as an evaluation, negative evaluation or judgment on of deconstructionism. I didn't see it. I didn't detect that this act of distancing. And the reason why was in my mind was because he kind of showed the inevitability of absurdism. You know, this is the way things are going, and he almost made a case for historical determinism, like cultural determinism. Like if these are the things that happen as literary theory progresses over time, absurdist moment will happen. Could be a matter of time, sooner or later. But so he was like, I saw himself as being involved in there and observing. And maybe the impact that he's going after is to encourage critics and readers to not take the whole business very seriously. But yeah.
No, that's totally fair. I mean, he starts off the essay saying kind of like literary criticism doesn't have any idea what it's doing right now, which creates a sort of negative feeling. But I do agree that there's almost a feeling of there's a logical progression here. It's almost, and maybe I'm wrong about it, it's almost like there's a feeling that if it stays here, there's a problem, or if it ends up eating itself, then there's a problem. And there's almost maybe a feeling of a nudge of, hey, we gotta sort this out. We gotta figure out what we're doing, because I basically just suggested that history is a literary genre, and I don't want all the historians coming over here and literary criticism not having a clue what it's doing. It's not going to work out too well. But I think that's fair, where there's a descriptive element and say this is the state of things. It makes sense that there was a logic that would lead you here, because maybe it was somewhat determined or probable that this would occur just by the nature of the foundations of Western thought, like he was saying at the end with Plato. I think that's a very fair reading. Whether my impression of it was he was suggesting we need to move on or figure out some sort of relationship between a way. Well, it gets back to this kind of idea where we learn how to interpret. We learn how to interpret where it doesn't become reductionist, but it also does not become Platonic, where we do believe that there's a text here and we're trying to figure out the different strings, where we don't just read it in terms of Marxism maybe, but also in terms of gender, also in terms of X, also in sociology, also in terms of narrative, where we learn how to do all those things as opposed to just simply isolating ourselves. And I think John's making a very good point. Perhaps the problem is that careerism can bring with it an isolationism of becoming an expert in a certain kind of interpretation, as opposed to having a Swiss, it's a violent image, maybe a toolbox instead of a Swiss Army knife. Instead of like a toolbox of different modes of interpretation, we say, well, let's try a Marxist interpretation here. Oh, that brings out some interesting. Well, let's try a traditionalist interpretation. Oh, that's interesting. Let's try it through the lens of religion. Oh, that's interesting. That doesn't tend to be what occurs perhaps so much because of the fetishization that then has each individual school isolating themselves into their particular method, so you don't get a growing dialectic between those things. And then before passing it on, I just wanted to know, John, that was really interesting on what you were saying about the internet. Before the internet, you could believe that like somebody knew everything, because now I'm thinking like before the printing press, and then the only book in the town that mattered was the Bible, and there was like one person who had the Bible, then that person could really create the impression of knowing everything and being the only person that knew everything.
Well, I mean, 200 years ago is an exaggeration, but I mean, they would say of people, in the 16th and maybe even the 17th century that, and when I say everything, I don't mean every single fact. I mean, everything important.
Right.
Everything important. Like you can quote Newton to you, you can quote, Aristotle or Epicurus and, whatever. But if the important things, right? But then that's the actual definition, or sort of what people were getting at when they talked about a Renaissance man, someone who could basically plumb the depths of nearly every field very, very thoroughly.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because that feeds into Platonism. Like if you encountered people and it was possible to really believe that people knew what was important, that in one person everything could be concentrated that is important, that leads into an idealistic way of thinking or normative way of thinking, as opposed to now when it's obvious that no one can know everything that's important, how that feeds a splinter view of where you have to have something maybe more like specialists or different things. But we've talked about some of the problems of specialists, but then some of the benefits of specialists. But and that's another conversation we've already had. But that's really interesting, John. I had not thought about how much easier it was to believe that someone actually knew everything relative to past information technologies. I mean, 300 or 400 years ago is not terribly long ago. No. Time moves so. I mean, 300 years ago sounds like a long time ago, but it's not. I kind of wanted to add something on and to agree with Davood that I guess if you give if say pre-1945, just to attach a year onto it, literary criticism was unified by the idea that we could use language to cast normative pictures or give normative statements about literature. And if we use that assumption to unify all of literary criticism, because that's basically what most of literary criticism was before the war, then that will break down. Because I think it's almost impossible to have something like 2 gigantic worldwide world wars and not have gigantic changes in basic assumptions about what language can do and how, in some sense, utterly powerless we are as people, and the absurdism in other senses of the word that we also see in the 20th century. Absurdist theater, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Both the strength of language, that what it can do and what it cannot do. And John, you mentioned in the beginning the worshipping of silence, and this is a posture of the contemporary, at least Hayden White's time, and maybe our time too. He says the more critics realize that they can't accomplish much, the more they talk, and it's like their helplessness is expressed with more and more, and almost a compulsive behavior, but compulsive speech, even though what they say, the content of what they're talking about is like, oh, we cannot, there's no point in criticism. There's no boundary between life and literature, and between literature and criticism. But they keep talking about that. So I wonder what you both thought about that kind of, that gesture of helplessness, and then speech, and then like the suppression of silence.
Well, what you just said reminded me of one of the conversations that we had recently in another context, but I think it applies here. The more that you talk, in a sense of sometimes you talk and we assume the meaning of talking is to convey information, but the steady flow of ideas or just words is meant to actually conceal an absence instead of to uncover a presence.
Mm-hmm.
You said that and I mean, it sort of made me stop in my tracks and think about how true that is sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That maybe, an entire branch of a pursuit like literary criticism can just be, a bunch of sound and fury.
While claiming that it is, claiming that for itself, but still going on.
Yeah.
And we could relate that to your point about careerism too. People need to publish to get their promotions, and to claim that they are doing things, and they're working. Yeah, we could maybe wrap up slowly our discussion of this chapter and say a few things about the book, the collection of essays in general as a whole.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I was just going to add on what you were saying about silence. Yeah, John put it very well. I mean, there can be a way to talk to hide the fact that there's nothing to say, or to hide the fact that you are saying something that has already been said, or that you are saying something that is not finished. A good dimension of Derrida that I think is valuable. It's funny because Derrida, someone once asked him in his house, and like, have you read all these books? And he's like, oh, no, I haven't read many at all. But the ones I have read, I know really well. And it was really interesting. Like Finnegan's Wake, he I think he did his dissertation on. He read it really, really close. He didn't read many books, but the ones he read really, really well. And that's kind of interesting because you have this idea of someone who's, texts don't, just kind of burning through them or whatever, but really he's reading them very well. And what's interesting is that the project of deconstruction in some respects, or some of the way that he put it forth. And of course, when you talk about deconstruction, you're not necessarily talking about Derrida's thought. You could be talking about like Paul de Man, a different thing. But anyway, it was kind of this idea that he would go, okay, so you got this complicated philosophical system, but you'll notice that if you go to the notes in the back, the footnotes that no one's supposed to look at, there's this kind of footnote here that unveils they can't justify that axiom on page 480. And if they can't justify that axiom on 480, the whole system doesn't work. And Derrida, from his close readings, would see how many systems would do that, how they would try to conceal these skips in logic, or these parts that aren't really addressed, and sort of put them in the back. Kant does that in one of them, where he's exploring the idea that if you could actually cross the noumenon, or the world of the things of themselves, that there would be no possibility of a moral life. Well, that's really weird. So he puts that in a really short fragment, and I can't remember, in like one of the backs of his books, and in Zizek and the Organ Book About Body talks about that. But anyway, the point is, and then I'll close, is this idea that another thing, you can have the words that are presented in the text hiding the incompleteness, or hiding the details that the thinker or the writer doesn't know in the back of the book. So you can also have words hiding other words that they're not as confident in, because if you really examine that footnote, you go, well, hold on, that doesn't make sense. Or, Derrida was suspicious of the fact that Heidegger didn't finish Being in Time and went off and wrote a bunch of essays. Like, well, wait a minute, hold on, wait, come back. Why didn't you finish that? Because we need to get to the being of being now. Why have we stopped? What does that unveil about the entire project? So another, you're talking about words to hide silence. Omission can hide silence, not mentioning, not getting around to, I'm going to write that essay tomorrow that addresses that problem. They just happen to never get around. So there are all these interesting methods of avoiding, of trying to avoid something, or just concentrating on your one stream of literary thought and not seeing how it fits into a broader canvas can also be another way of avoiding the truths of if your project or what you're doing adds value and insight.
Daniel said, just made me think of a little vignette about Umberto Eco. I think he had his house in Bologna or something where he taught at the university. And someone walked into his house one day and he had a gigantic library, something like 30,000 books. And someone asked him a similar question, have you read all of these books? And he said, no, these are just the ones I have to finish by the end of the week.
Yeah. I think he himself or Nassim Nicholas Taleb remembers this episode and says only people who don't read books, they ask questions like that. Because if you're really a reader, you know that you haven't read most of your books,
Yes.
Most of the books in your personal library. You have them because you want to read them.
That's right.
And yeah.
Oh, and I love that because Nassim, Mr. Taleb calls it the anti-library, which is to remind you, most of us have libraries to feel like we know a lot, when actually you need a library to remind you how little you know.
Mm-hmm.
In some respects, it's better to have the books on your bookshelf you haven't read, so you can always go, I'm not as smart as I think, versus the ones that you have read that you can show off to your neighbors when they walk in. I always love that lovely inversion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. My neighbors never come in. I can't.
So put them where you want. Just put them where you want.
Yeah.
Your cat loves you regardless. You don't have to prove yourself.
Thanks. So a few words. I didn't really prepare for an overall discussion and assessment of this book, but
we pulled him into it, everyone. We pulled him into it.
No, I'm glad. First, let me add this note. I'm very grateful to John for introducing me to Hayden White. It was a really nice surprise, very pleasant surprise. Sometimes you have these ideas, not fully formed ideas, some inclinations, and then you meet an author that really has expressed all those thoughts in their full form. So that was, I really appreciated those some of those early essays, especially. They gave voice and expression to some of my own problems in the discipline of psychology and what history does in psychology. So I really enjoyed this reading experience, and the discussion was an added benefit. I see, to put it briefly, I see Hayden White's task to be very close to deconstruction. So he wants to deflate or blur or challenge the boundary between, for example, description and interpretation. So I really appreciate that, facts and fiction. So he spent some of the early essays exploring those dichotomies, those categories, that what we consider to be a fact has a lot of interpretive elements already in it, has a lot of tropic, metaphorical, linguistic flourishes that they are not added to it, they enable it. They enable a factual description. Similarly, his discussion of history and historicism, that historicism, which claims history to be lawful, expressive of regularity, general laws and regularities that can be scientifically addressed. He said that, well, that shouldn't be accepted, but we should at the same time keep in mind that history always kind of secretly, implicitly tries to move towards historicism. So that inflationary tendency exists not only in literary criticism, but also in history. And also, of course, he talks about historical works as literary artifacts, blurring or challenging the boundary between history and literature. And then he has these a couple of celebratory essays, talking about Foucault, talking about Vico, his heroes, and those were also really nice. I enjoyed reading them to read more about the influences behind his work, scholarship. Yeah, that's for me.
What I liked most about all of the essays was that White seems to be walking a pretty fine line between pretty much respecting interdisciplinary boundaries while also blurring them. And I think reading him does, in the early essays, certainly the first 4 or 5, remind you how much history and the writing of history borrows from the idea of tropes and the theory of like genres, how you can implot things in different ways and use different sort of literary devices to tell a story. And in that same way, it sort of clues you into how other disciplines might be, or certainly are. I know Davood could stand up and give us a 3-hour lecture right now about the philosophical assumptions that are implicit in psychology. There's tons of them.
At least 20 minutes.
I know that. I mean, I haven't even talked with you about that, and I know it's something you've thought about. Psychology is, of course, much newer as a formal discipline than literary criticism or historiography are, but it's interesting to think about how branches of knowledge come into their own, and how once they arise, they are still related in sort of, they leave their trace in how they came out from other branches, but then they also try to hide that trace. And what I think Hayden White does is he sort of redefines the lines around certain branches of knowledge: literary criticism, historiography, history, intellectual history, and reminds you of those lines and those genealogies where it's appropriate.
That was beautiful. Again, Hayden White is one of those people who, again, I'm grateful for John and both of you, because I didn't know about Hayden White. And it's another example of someone you go through life in your pursuit to be an educated citizen of the world, is, the responsibility of being an active member. And you're like, oh, I didn't know about this person. Why didn't I know about this person? And it just, there's something exciting about that whenever I encounter a new thinker or a book like that, because it's like, who else is out there that I don't know about, who can add so much to your thinking in the ways that both of you have described. I think that's part of the excitement of reading. And it is also, although there's something disturbing about it no longer being possible to feel like you know everything, like they could say before the printing press, there's a flip side to that that's also really exciting, because I don't know everything, and what else could there be that could actually expand your sense of the world in a really great way. And so it's been exciting to encounter Mr. White. I'll echo what Davood is saying. One of the things I really appreciate about Mr. White is he's someone who is taking seriously what we have learned from deconstruction without making it destructive per se. I think the word deconstruction from Derrida is tied to Heidegger's notion of a clearing, of making a clearing to build something new. You're tearing down, like you're moving aside in order to make a space for something else to grow. Unfortunately, I think Mr. White is correct that many people following deconstruction are actually more destructive, where they tear down, and there's not necessarily an idea of what to replace it with. I think properly understood, deconstruction is always supposed to be in service of reconstruction and reconstituting, but in such a manner that doesn't fall into the same mistakes as the past, say by essentializing, like Foucault says, or by Platonic forms that make everything else not even fully real, or so on. So how do you carry out this reconstitution that is making something, but also has learned? And White has shown some of the moves he thinks you need to engage to do that. You, one, need to understand that a lot of disciplines are trying to hide their trace, just like you described, John, or that history has a literary, it's structured. It has a structure that is literary, and that by acknowledging that, then we actually have an idea of what we should fill the clearing with. And that is taking interpretation seriously, paying attention to the genres that are in operation, the nature of the emplotment, that will help us really understand the text and build it anew in a manner that is solid. Deconstruction can make a clearing to build something that's solid, but not solid in a sort of oppressive, essentializing and shutting down the conversation, but solid like you can get a handle on it so that you can pass it around to other people to get their handle on it. This kind of blend between interpretation and, the hard take on things. So I appreciate Mr. White, to as a beginning overview thought, I really appreciate that he's actually feels like he, just like you're saying, Davood, he's taking seriously deconstruction, but in a reconstructive manner, making a clearing, taking seriously what we've learned, and then saying, okay, well, what can we do about that is going to help us reconstruct something that is new and good, but has taken seriously what we've learned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I really think, and I would encourage, one of the reasons why I would encourage other people to give this a try is that White, through his writing, his style of writing and thinking, he encourages responsibility and responsible thinking, that we can never truly disown our descriptions. Disown, when I say disown, I mean a description that I found that I've given, an account that I've given, that is so true that I can just remove myself from it, that I can say it's no longer even my responsibility. It's that true. It is that factual. And White says that we cannot claim a lack of responsibility because our trace of the trace of our activity, the acts of design and construction and emplotment is always there. So we that remaining responsible and remaining attached and engaged with the way we interpret and describe reality and history is important. It's something that is a consequence of his writing, which I also appreciate. All right. Anything else? Any final notes?
It's been fun.
It's been fun.
It has been fun.
It has been fun. And we just started.
Yeah, we did, didn't we?
Yeah.
No, I just wanted, on what you're saying with responsibility, I love the idea of, we tend to think that if interpretation is involved, then it doesn't matter. But in fact, he's saying, no, if interpretation is involved, we're responsible. So we have to take it with more seriousness, and we have to think more about it, that interpretation equals responsibility. I think that is a really important idea.
Great. Thank you very much, both.
Gentlemen, this has been a delight.
And till next year and our next book.